She had 30 seconds to catch the train to her future, but a dying stranger had only seconds to live. Elena Vance chose to stay, and she watched her dreams disappear down the tracks. What she didn't know was that the man gasping for air was worth $50 billion. The darkness in the Bronx doesn't just fall, it settles like lead. At 4:15 a.m., the silence of Elena Vance's apartment was shattered by the rhythmic, piercing scream of an alarm clock. It was a sound she hated, a sound that reminded her she was still trapped in a cycle that felt like a slow-motion car crash. Elena didn't move at first. She lay there, staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to the radiator hiss. Beside her, on a sagging sofa that had seen better decades, her younger brother, Leo, was buried under 3 blankets. He was 19, brilliant, and exhausted. His dreams of becoming a chemical engineer were currently buried under a stack of outdated, coffee-stained textbooks he'd scavenged from a library sale. Elena stood up, her feet hitting the cold linoleum floor. Every joint ached. At 26, she felt 50. She had spent the last 3 years working 2 jobs, one at a grease-slicked diner called the Rusty Anchor, and another cleaning the sterile, glass-walled offices of the people she wished she could be. She tiptoed to the bathroom, splashing ice-cold water on her face. The mirror didn't lie. The dark circles under her eyes were like bruises, the tax she paid for surviving on 4 hours of sleep. But today had to be different. Today, she had an interview at Sterling Dynamics. Sterling Dynamics wasn't just a company, it was the sun that the entire city orbited. They built the skyscrapers, they funded the hospitals, and they owned the future. A receptionist position there paid more than both her current jobs combined. It meant health insurance for Leo's chronic asthma. It meant a real bed for him. It meant hope. By 5:30 a.m., she was at the diner. The smell of burnt coffee and cheap bacon filled the air. "You're late, Vance," grunted Hank, the cook, without looking up from the griddle. 3 minutes, Hank. The bus didn't show, Elena replied, tying her apron with trembling fingers. For the next 6 hours, she was a ghost in a uniform. She poured coffee for men who didn't look at her and wiped up spills for people who didn't say thank you. By 11:30 a.m., her shift ended. She sat in the back room, counting her tips. $28.40. She stared at the crumpled bills. Rent was due. The electric bill was a week late. Leo needed a specific textbook for his advanced chemistry final, a book that cost $80. She felt that familiar, cold knot of panic tightening in her chest. The what-if monster was clawing at her throat. What if she didn't get this job? What if this was it for the rest of her life? She walked home in the biting wind, passing the colossal glass spire of the Sterling Dynamics headquarters. It glowed in the midday sun like a diamond. She watched the executives stride through the revolving doors in suits that cost more than her car. They looked like they belonged to a different species, one that never had to choose between a subway pass and a meal. Back at the apartment, Leo was hunched over the kitchen table. "How was the shift?" he asked, his voice raspy. "Good, Leo, real good," she lied, her voice bright with a fake confidence she didn't feel. "I've got the interview at 2:00, Sterling Dynamics. You know what that means." Leo looked up, and for a second, the exhaustion left his eyes. "It means we're getting out of here, Elle. It means you won't have to scrub floors at midnight anymore." Elena pulled out her one good outfit, a charcoal blazer she'd found at a thrift store and meticulously ironed. She straightened her shoulders, looking at her reflection. She didn't see a waitress. She saw a warrior. "Wish me luck," she said, heading for the door. "You don't need luck," Leo called out. "You're a Vance, we don't break." As she walked toward the subway station, the sky began to bruise with heavy purple clouds. The air turned electric. Elena checked her watch. 1:15 p.m. If she caught the 1:30 express, she'd be 10 minutes early. Perfect. But as she stepped onto the platform of the bustling station, she had no idea that her life wasn't about to be changed by an interview. It was about to be changed by a heartbeat that was about to stop. Grand Central Station pulsed with a frantic, rhythmic energy. Thousands of souls surged across the concrete, their footsteps a thundering heartbeat that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. Elena Vance stood on the edge of the yellow safety line, her fingers white-knuckled as she gripped her soggy resume folder. She checked her phone. 1:47 p.m. The 1:50 express was her last hope. If she missed this train, the interview at Sterling Dynamics, the interview that was supposed to save her family from the crushing weight of the Bronx, would be nothing more than a ghost of a chance. The air on the platform was thick, smelling of ozone, old grease, and the collective anxiety of 1,000 commuters. To her left, a businessman screamed into his Bluetooth. To her right, a teenager practiced dance moves for a silent audience. Everyone was focused on their own destination. Then she saw him. He was sitting on a weathered wooden bench, tucked away in a corner of the platform. He looked out of place, like a relic from a more elegant era. He wore an expensive-looking charcoal wool coat, though it was now damp from the rain that had begun to leak through the station's aging vents. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, but his face was the color of wet ash. Elena slowed her pace. Something was wrong, very wrong. The man's hands were trembling, gripping a vintage leather portfolio with 2 gold initials embossed on the corner. A.S. His eyes were wide, unfocused, staring at the bustling crowd but seeing nothing. His lips moved in a silent, desperate prayer, but no sound came out. All aboard. Final call for the 1:50 Downtown Express. The conductor's voice sliced through the air like a blade. Elena's head snapped toward the tracks. The train was there, a silver beast idling at the platform, its doors open like an invitation to a better life. She had maybe 30 seconds before those doors hissed shut, taking her dreams of a $45,000 a year salary with them. She looked at the train. She looked at the man. He tried to stand, his legs buckling like a folding chair. He let out a sharp, ragged gasp and clutched his chest, his knuckles turning a ghostly white. He swayed dangerously toward the edge of the platform. 20 seconds. The man's eyes suddenly locked onto Elena. In that moment, the noise of the station faded into a dull hum. She saw it then, not just pain, but pure, unadulterated terror. He was drowning in plain sight, and the world was just walking past him as if he didn't exist. Please! The word barely escaped his lips, a broken whisper that tore through Elena's soul. Help me! 10 seconds. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. The moment her life would divide into 2 paths. Down one path was the interview, the job, the money Leo needed for his books, and the security they had prayed for since their parents died. Down the other path was a stranger who might be dying on a cold bench in a station that didn't care. She thought of Leo sleeping on that couch. She thought of the $28 in her pocket. 5 seconds. The conductor raised his hand. The warning chime began to play, a melodic death knell for her ambitions. Elena Vance didn't think. She didn't calculate. She simply let go. She dropped her bag and the resume she'd spent 3 days perfecting. She watched as the folder hit the dirty floor, the pages fluttering like wounded birds. And then she ran. Not toward the train, but toward the man. The doors of the express hissed shut with a final, mechanical thud. The train began to move, accelerating into the darkness of the tunnel, taking her one chance at a real career with it. Elena knelt on the cold concrete beside the stranger. Sir, stay with me," she cried out, her voice filled with a desperate command. Close up, he looked even worse. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the drafty chill of the station. His breathing was shallow, a terrifying, wet sound that rattled in his chest. He was gripping his portfolio so hard his fingers were turning blue. "My chest," he wheezed, his voice barely a shadow of a sound. "Can't catch air." Elena's hands shook as she fumbled for her phone. "I'm calling for help. You just keep looking at me, okay? Look at me, Arthur," she said, guessing his name from the initials on his bag. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice was calm, a sharp contrast to the storm in Elena's head. "I'm at Grand Central, Platform 4, Elena said, her voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "I have an elderly male, mid-70s, presenting with severe chest pain and respiratory distress. He's conscious but gray. We need an ambulance now." As she spoke, she gently unbuttoned the top of his silk shirt and loosened his tie, trying to give his lungs room to fight. His skin felt clammy and cold, like marble. "The meeting," he managed to choke out, his eyes darting toward the exit where the skyline of Manhattan loomed above. They're waiting. Important." "Forget the meeting, Arthur," Elena whispered, squeezing his hand. "Right now, the only thing that's important is your next breath. Focus on me, just me." In the distance, the first faint wail of a siren began to rise over the city's din. But as the sound got closer, the man's grip on Elena's hand began to slacken. His eyes started to roll back, the terror being replaced by a haunting, empty glassiness. Arthur, stay with me." Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was an unknown number. Likely Sterling Dynamics, wondering why their 2:00 p.m. interview was 5 minutes late. She could still leave. She could flag down a transit cop, hand over the man, and run for a taxi. She might still make it if she lied about a subway delay. She looked at the man's face, a face that looked like her father's in his final hours. Elena reached into her pocket, took out the phone, and hit decline. She threw the phone back into her bag and gripped the man's hand with both of hers. "I'm not going anywhere," she promised. What Elena Vance didn't know was that her decision to miss that train was the greatest investment she would ever make. She didn't know that the man whose hand she was holding wasn't just a stranger in a wool coat. She was holding the hand of the man who owned the very building she was supposed to be sitting in, and he was about to give her a lot more than a receptionist job. The blue and red lights of the ambulance splashed against the grime-streaked walls of Grand Central like a rhythmic heartbeat. Within seconds, the silence Elena had tried to maintain was shattered. "Make way, move, clear the platform." The EMTs descended like a whirlwind of neon vests and heavy equipment. Elena was pushed aside, her shoulder hitting a cold iron pillar. She watched, breathless, as they swarmed over the man she now knew only as Arthur. They worked with a clinical, terrifying efficiency. The snap of latex gloves, the hiss of an oxygen mask, the rhythmic thump-thump of a portable heart monitor. Vitals are crashing. He's in VFib, prepare to shock. The sound of the defibrillator charging, a high-pitched, rising whine, sent a shiver down Elena's spine. Clear. The man's body jerked, a violent, unnatural movement that looked like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. Elena stood there, frozen. Her resume, the paper that was supposed to be her golden ticket, lay several feet away, trampled by the heavy boots of the paramedics. A muddy footprint now covered the section where she had listed her commitment to excellence. "We've got a pulse. Let's move people now." As they lifted the gurney, one of the EMTs, a young man with tired eyes, looked at Elena. "You the one who called it in?" Yes, Elena whispered, her voice cracking. I stayed with him. You saved him some time, the EMT said, already pushing the gurney toward the elevator. But he's not out of the woods. You coming? We need a statement for the intake. Elena looked at her phone. 2:15 p.m. The interview was 15 minutes ago. In the world of high-stakes corporate recruiting, 15 minutes late was the same as being dead. She had already lost the job. She had already let Leo down. If she left now, she'd be going back to a life of grease-stained aprons and empty pockets with nothing to show for her sacrifice. I'm coming, she said, her voice growing stronger. The ride in the back of the ambulance was a blur of high-speed turns and the smell of antiseptic. Elena sat in a small folding seat, her eyes fixed on Arthur. He looked so small under the heavy blankets, his face a map of wrinkles and history. She wondered who he was. Did he have a wife waiting for him to come home for dinner? Did he have children who were too busy to call? They arrived at Metropolitan General, a fortress of glass and steel. Arthur was whisked away through double doors marked restricted access. Elena was left in the waiting room, a place where time goes to die. The air in the hospital was cold, carrying the faint, metallic scent of blood and floor wax. Elena sat on a plastic chair, her hands tucked under her arms to stop the shaking. She took out her phone. 3 missed calls from an unknown number. She knew it was Sterling Dynamics. With a heavy heart, she dialed the number back. A woman with a voice like sharpened ice answered on the second ring. Sterling Dynamics, Executive Suite. How may I direct your call? Hi, my name is Elena Vance. I had an interview at 2:00 for the administrative position. I'm so sorry. There was a medical emergency at the station and... Miss Vance, the voice cut her off, cold and final. Mr. Sterling's schedule is managed down to the second. We have 42 other candidates waiting in the lobby. We do not do emergencies. We do results. Please, Elena begged, her voice a low, desperate hum. I just need 10 minutes. I'm a hard worker, The position has been filled, Miss Vance. Good luck with your emergency. Click. The line went dead. Elena stared at the black screen of her phone. She felt a tear slide down her cheek, hot and stinging. She had gambled her future on a stranger's life, and she had lost. Elena. She looked up. Standing in the doorway of the waiting room was a man who looked like he had stepped out of a movie. He was tall, perhaps in his mid-40s, wearing a tailored navy suit that screamed power. His hair was slicked back and his eyes were sharp, scanning the room like a hawk. I'm Elena, she said, wiping her face quickly. The man walked toward her, his expensive leather shoes clicking on the linoleum. I'm Marcus Thorne. I'm the chief operating officer for the gentleman you helped. Arthur's personal staff contacted me through his GPS vitals. He looked at Elena, really looked at her, and for a second his icy demeanor softened. He saw the charcoal blazer from the thrift store. He saw the muddy resume folder clutched in her lap. He saw the exhaustion of a woman who had been fighting her whole life. The doctor said you stayed with him, Marcus said, his voice low. Most people would have just called 911 and walked away. Why didn't you? Elena looked at the double doors where Arthur had disappeared. He looked like he was alone, she said simply. Nobody should have to face the end alone. Marcus Thorne went silent. He checked his gold watch, a timepiece that probably cost more than Elena's apartment building. Do you know who that man is, Elena? His name is Arthur, she replied. That's all I know. Marcus leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. That man is Arthur Sterling, the founder of Sterling Dynamics, the man whose building you were supposed to be in 30 minutes ago. Elena's heart stopped. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. The man she had saved. was the man who owned the company that had just rejected her. He was on his way to the station because he likes to take the train once a month, Marcus continued, a faint smile playing on his lips. He says it keeps him connected to the pulse of the city. Today, that pulse almost stopped. Suddenly, the double doors swung open. A doctor emerged, looking weary but relieved. He's stabilized. He's asking for the woman who held his hand. Marcus turned to Elena. It seems the chairman wants to see you. And Elena. Yes. I wouldn't worry about that phone call you just had with our HR department. In this company, Arthur's word is the only one that matters. Elena stood up, her legs feeling like jelly. She followed Marcus toward the intensive care unit. As she walked, she thought of Leo. She thought of the $28 in her pocket. And she realized that sometimes the train you miss is the one that leads you exactly where you were always meant to go. But the drama was far from over. Because Arthur Sterling didn't just want to thank her. He had a secret, one that involved Elena's own past and a debt that had been waiting 20 years to be paid. The doors open, and the golden light of the ICU reveals a man changed. But is Elena ready for the truth Arthur is about to reveal? The room was bathed in a pale, sterile blue light. It was silent, save for the rhythmic, electronic chirp of the heart monitor, the only thing standing between Arthur Sterling and the void. He looked smaller now, stripped of his charcoal wool coat and his aura of untouchable power. He was just a man, tethered to the world by plastic tubes and a thin, trembling thread of hope. Elena stood at the foot of the bed. She felt like an intruder, a ghost from the streets of New York haunting a palace of medicine. Marcus Thorne stood by the window, his silhouette sharp against the city skyline, watching her with eyes that calculated everything and revealed nothing. Come closer, Elena. Arthur's voice was a dry rasp, like sandpaper on silk. She took a step forward. Her hand instinctively went to the small, tarnished silver locket hanging around her neck, the only thing she had left of her mother. Arthur turned his head toward her. His eyes were no longer clouded with the fog of a heart attack. They were sharp, piercing. They searched her face as if looking for a map to a hidden treasure. Vance, Arthur whispered, the name hanging in the air like a question. You said your name was Elena Vance. Yes, sir, she replied, her voice barely audible. Arthur's hand, thin and translucent, reached out. He wasn't reaching for her hand. His eyes were fixed on the locket. That necklace, where did you get it? Elena hesitated. It was my mother's, Sarah Vance. She passed away 10 years ago. My father, Elias, followed her shortly after. Why do you ask? The heart monitor's rhythm spiked. Chirp, 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 chirp. Marcus Thorne moved from the window, his brow furrowed. Arthur, you need to rest, the doctors said. Quiet, Marcus, Arthur snapped, a flash of the Titan returning to his eyes. He looked back at Elena, and for the first time she saw a tear escape the corner of his eye. It traced a path through the deep wrinkles of his cheek. Elias Vance wasn't just a name. He was the finest structural engineer I ever knew. He was my partner. Elena felt the floor tilt. Her father, Elias, had been a quiet man who smelled of sawdust and old blueprints. He had worked long hours at a construction firm, coming home with calloused hands and a tired smile. He had never mentioned Sterling Dynamics. He had never mentioned being a partner to a billionaire. My father, he was a laborer, Elena said, her voice trembling. He worked for a small firm in Brooklyn. We lived in a 2-room apartment. He died with nothing but a stack of medical bills and an old toolbox. Arthur let out a long, shuddering breath. He looked away, staring at the ceiling as if he could see the past written there. He died with nothing, because I let them take everything from him. The silence that followed was suffocating. Marcus Thorne shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Arthur and Elena. 25 years ago, Arthur began, his voice gaining a haunting strength. Sterling Dynamics was a fledgling company. We had a vision, but we didn't have the technology. Your father, Elias, he designed the Vance stabilizer. It's the reason our skyscrapers can reach the clouds without swaying in the wind. It's the foundation of this entire empire. He paused, a coughing fit racking his thin frame. Marcus moved to call a nurse, but Arthur waved him off. I was young, I was ambitious, and I was surrounded by vultures, Arthur continued. The board of directors. They saw Elias as a liability, a dreamer who wanted to give the technology away for free to build a better world. They staged a coup. They forged his signature on a patent release. They threw him out of the company he helped build. And I, God forgive me, I stayed silent. I chose the empire over the man who gave me the keys to it. Elena felt a cold, sharp anger beginning to boil in her chest. Her father had spent his life in poverty. He had watched her mother die because they couldn't afford the experimental treatments that might have saved her. He had worked himself into an early grave, all while the man in this bed sat on a throne made of her father's stolen dreams. You let him rot, Elena said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, low vibrato. You watched him struggle while you built $1 billion legacy on his back. I did, Arthur whispered, and I have spent 20 years looking for him. By the time I found the trail, it led to a grave in the Bronx. I thought the debt was one I would carry to my own grave, until today. He looked at her, his eyes shining with a desperate, frantic light. I didn't collapse today because of my heart, Elena. I collapsed because I saw you in the station. I saw your mother's face. I saw the girl from the old photographs Elias used to keep on his desk. My heart didn't fail me. It finally woke up. Marcus Thorne stepped forward, his voice cold and professional. Arthur, this is a legal nightmare. If the board finds out about this, if there's a surviving heir to the Vance patents, the company's stock will vanish overnight. We need to handle this quietly. Quietly? Arthur let out a bitter laugh. Marcus, I am 78 years old. I have enough money to buy the moon, and I am dying in a room that smells like bleach. The quiet is coming for me soon enough. Arthur reached out and grabbed Elena's wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong. Elena, the interview you missed today. It wasn't for a receptionist. I knew you were coming. I made sure your resume stayed on top of the pile. I wanted to see if you were like him. I wanted to see if the daughter of Elias Vance had his soul. He leaned in closer, his voice a conspiratorial hiss. You missed that train to save a man who didn't deserve it. You chose mercy over money. You passed the test your father would have passed. What are you saying? Elena asked. I'm saying that Sterling Dynamics doesn't belong to the board of directors, Arthur said, a predatory glint in his eye. And it doesn't belong to Marcus. It belongs to the Vance family. But there are people in that building who will kill to keep it. People who have been hiding the truth for 25 years. Suddenly, the door to the ICU burst open. 2 men in dark suits, wearing earpieces, stepped inside. They didn't look like doctors. They looked like the kind of men who made problems disappear. Mr. Sterling, one of the men said, his voice flat. The board has called an emergency session. They've heard about the incident at the station. They are requesting Miss Vance be escorted from the building for security reasons. Marcus Thorne looked at the men, then at Elena. A slow, dark smile spread across his face. You heard them, Elena. It's time to go back to the Bronx. Some dreams are too big to survive the daylight. Arthur's grip on Elena's wrist tightened. Don't leave, he whispered. If you walk out that door, they will make sure you never speak of this. Stay, fight, take what is yours. Elena looked at the guards. She looked at Marcus's smug, cold face. She thought of Leo. She thought of her father's calloused hands. The waitress from the Bronx was gone. In her place stood the heir to an empire. "I'm not going anywhere," Elena said, her voice ringing out like a strike on an anvil. "In fact, I think I'd like to see that board of directors now." The lions are circling, and Elena Vance just walked into the cage, but she isn't the prey. She's the one with the map to the exit. The 99th floor of the Sterling Dynamics spire was a cathedral of glass and cold, white marble. Here, the noise of the New York City streets, the honking, the shouting, the struggle, was a distant, forgotten memory. Up here, the only sound was the low, expensive hum of the climate control and the rhythmic click-clack of Elena's worn-down heels on the polished floor. She was flanked by the two men in dark suits. They didn't speak. They didn't look at her. They moved with the mechanical precision of predators. Marcus Thorne walked 10 paces ahead, his back straight, his silhouette sharp against the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over a sea of clouds. "Wait here," Marcus said, stopping in front of a massive set of obsidian double doors. Elena stood in the hallway. She looked at her reflection in the glass. Her charcoal blazer was wrinkled. There was a smudge of hospital grime on her cheek. She looked like a smudge of dirt on a pristine white canvas. She felt the urge to run, to find a service elevator and disappear back into the Bronx, back to the safety of her struggle. But then she felt the locket against her skin. Elias Vance. Her father had been erased from this building. His name had been scrubbed from the lobby, his genius stolen and rebranded. If she left now, he would stay dead. The doors swung open. The boardroom was a vast, circular chamber. At the center sat a table made of a single slab of ancient redwood. Around it sat 12 people, the board of directors. These were the architects of the city's economy. They didn't look like villains, they looked like grandfathers and grandmothers, wearing silk and gold. But their eyes were as cold as deep-sea ice. At the head of the table sat a man who looked like he was carved from granite. Julian Vane. He had been the one who pushed her father out 25 years ago. "Marcus," Julian said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone. "You've brought the guest. I assume she's here to sign the non-disclosure and the waiver." Marcus took his seat at the table, his face unreadable. "Actually, Julian, there's been a complication. Arthur has spoken to her. He's told her everything." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The rustle of expensive paper stopped. Every eye in the room turned toward Elena. "Everything is a very broad term," Julian said, leaning forward. He didn't look at Elena, he looked through her. "Arthur is a sick man. His mind is wandering. He sees shadows of the past where there are only business realities. Miss Vance, I'm sorry for your father's history, but Sterling Dynamics is a public entity. It belongs to its shareholders, not to the daughter of a man who couldn't handle the pressure of the industry." Elena took a step forward. Her heart was a drum in her ears, but her voice was steady. "My father didn't fail because of pressure, Mr. Vane. He failed because you stole the Vance stabilizer. You forged a patent release while he was mourning his wife. You took his life's work and turned it into your personal gold mine." One of the board members, a woman with pearls as big as marbles, let out a soft, mocking laugh. "Forgery. That's a very heavy word for a girl with no evidence and a bank account that probably wouldn't cover the cost of this table." "I have the locket," Elena said, her hand going to her neck. "A piece of silver doesn't hold up in a court of law, Miss Vance," Julian snapped. He stood up, towering over the table. "You are an inconvenience, a relic of a mistake we buried decades ago. We are prepared to offer you a settlement. $500,000. Enough to get you and your brother out of that hovel in the Bronx. You sign a paper, you walk away, and you never mention the name Elias Vance again." $500,000. In Elena's head, the numbers began to whirl. That was college for Leo. That was a house. That was a life where she didn't have to count quarters for the laundromat. It was more money than she would see in 10 lifetimes of waitressing. Julian saw the flicker of hesitation in her eyes. He smiled, a thin, predatory curl of the lip. Think of your brother, Elena. Don't be a martyr for a dead man's pride. Take the money. Go home. Elena looked at the check Julian had slid across the redwood table. It looked so simple, just a signature. One lie and the struggle would be over. But then she remembered the man on the bench, Arthur Sterling. He had billions, and yet he was dying in a room that smelled like bleach, haunted by the one debt he couldn't pay. If she took this money, she wasn't just selling her father's legacy, she was selling her own soul. My father always told me something, Elena said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. The board members leaned in, forced to listen to her silence. He said that a building is only as strong as its foundation. If the foundation is built on a lie, eventually the whole thing comes crashing down. She picked up the check. For a second, Julian's smile widened. Then Elena tore it in half, then in quarters. She let the pieces flutter onto the table like snow. I don't want your money, she said. I want the company. I want every patent, every floor of this building, and I want my father's name back on the front door. Julian's face turned a deep, bruised purple. You're insane. You have nothing. Security, get her out of here. The two men in suits moved toward her. But before they could reach her, the massive monitors on the boardroom wall flickered to life. It was a live feed from the hospital. Arthur Sterling was sitting up in bed. He looked weak, but his eyes were blazing. He was holding a leather portfolio, the same one Elena had seen him clutching on the platform. The girl is right, Arthur's voice boomed through the boardroom speakers, echoing off the glass walls. Julian, I knew you'd try to buy her off. That's why I didn't give her the evidence at the hospital. I gave it to her at the station. Elena looked down at her muddy resume folder, which she was still clutching. She opened it. Tucked behind her coffee-stained resume was a thin, blue piece of paper. It was a microfilm strip, encased in plastic. That, Arthur whispered from the screen, is the original blueprint, the one with the real signatures. The one you thought I burned in '99, Julian. I kept it, as my insurance policy, as my confession. The boardroom erupted into chaos. Julian lunged across the table, his face a mask of rage. Marcus, take it from her, now. Marcus Thorne stood up. He looked at the screaming board members. He looked at the trembling Elena. And then he looked at Julian Vane. No, Marcus said calmly. He stepped in front of Elena, shielding her from the security guards. The chairman has spoken, and as of 5 minutes ago, Arthur Sterling has transferred his voting proxy to Miss Vance. Marcus turned to Elena and gave a small, respectful bow. The board is now in session, Miss Vance, Marcus said. What is your first order of business? Elena looked at Julian Vane, who was now sinking back into his chair, his face the color of ash. She looked at the city below, the city her father had helped build from the shadows. My first order of business, Elena said, a cold, hard light in her eyes. Call the police. I want to report a 25-year-old robbery. But as the sirens began to wail in the distance, a new shadow appeared at the boardroom door. A man Elena didn't recognize, carrying a briefcase and wearing a look of grim satisfaction. Not so fast, the man said. There's a small matter of the Vance stabilizer's actual origin, and it didn't start with Elia's. A new player enters the game, and the foundation of Sterling Dynamics just began to crack. Is Elena ready for a truth that goes even deeper than her father's lies? The man standing in the doorway was the polar opposite of the polished board members. He wore a wrinkled trench coat that smelled of old rain and cheap cigars. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with the weariness of a man who had spent too many nights looking into the dark corners of history. He carried a heavy, battered leather briefcase that looked like it had been dragged through a war zone. "And who the hell are you?" Julian Vane roared, his voice cracking with the strain of his crumbling empire. The man didn't flinch. He walked to the center of the room, ignoring the security guards and the billion-dollar views. He set his briefcase on the redwood table with a heavy thud that seemed to vibrate through the floor. "My name is Silas Thorne," the man said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "And before you ask, yes, I'm Marcus's brother. But unlike my brother, I don't work for the winners. I work for the truth. I'm a forensic historian, and I've been tracking the Vance stabilizer since before Elena was born." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She looked at Marcus, who had gone remarkably pale. The brothers locked eyes for a second, one the image of corporate success, the other the image of a man who had lost everything to find the why. "Silas, this isn't the time," Marcus whispered, his voice taut. "It's exactly the time," Silas countered. He snapped open the latches of his briefcase. He pulled out a stack of blueprints, not the blue ones Elena had, but something older, yellowed, hand-drawn on vellum that looked like it would crumble if touched by a breeze. "Arthur Sterling told you that your father, Elias, designed the stabilizer," Silas said, looking directly at Elena. "He wasn't lying, but he wasn't telling you the whole truth either. Elias Vance didn't invent this technology in a lab. He found it." Elena shook her head. "Found it? What are you talking about? My father was a genius. He worked on those designs for years." "He worked on refining them," Silas corrected. He spread the yellowed papers across the table. "These are the original schematics for the foundations of this very city. They date back to 1924. Look at the signature at the bottom, Elena." Elena leaned in. The ink was faded, a ghostly brown, but the name was unmistakable. Elias Vance S.R. "Your grandfather," Silas whispered. "He was a master mason during the Great Depression. He saw the city rising, and he saw the flaws in the steel. He realized that as buildings grew taller, the earth beneath them would eventually reject them. He created the prototype of the stabilizer using old-world physics, things they don't teach in engineering school anymore." The board members were leaning in now, their greed temporarily replaced by a primal curiosity. "But here's the secret," Silas continued, his voice dropping to a low, rhythmic cadence. "The stabilizer isn't just a piece of engineering. It's a key. Your grandfather knew that the people who controlled the heights of New York would eventually try to control the people below. He built a kill switch into the design, a way to destabilize the vibrations of the building if it was ever used for, let's call it, unnatural purposes." Julian Vane laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "Ghost stories and kill switches? This is a corporate boardroom, not a Gothic novel. Security, I'm not asking again. Remove them all." "Wait," Marcus Thorne said, his voice cutting through Julian's command. He was looking at the monitors where Arthur Sterling was still watching from his hospital bed. Arthur's face had gone from relief to a mask of sheer terror. "Arthur," Marcus said, Did you know the stabilizer could bring the building down?" Arthur didn't answer. He simply closed his eyes and turned his head away from the camera. The silence was his confession. Silas turned back to Elena. "Elena, your father didn't just lose the company because of greed. He was trying to protect you. He knew that the board wanted to weaponize the stabilizer. They wanted to use the infrasonic frequencies it generates to influence the crowds in the streets below, to create a sense of unease, of compliance. High-altitude mind control disguised as architecture." Elena felt a wave of nausea. She looked at the polished marble floors, the glass walls, the elegant lights. The building wasn't just a monument to her father's stolen dreams, it was a weapon, and she was currently standing in the center of the barrel. "The reason they need you to sign those papers, Elena," Silas said, stepping closer, "is because the kill switch is biometric. It's keyed to the Vance bloodline. Your father hid the frequency trigger in that locket you're wearing. He knew that one day the building would become a monster, and he wanted his daughter to be the one who could put it to sleep." Suddenly, the lights in the boardroom flickered. A low, deep hum began to vibrate through the soles of Elena's shoes. It wasn't the hum of the air conditioning. It was a sound that felt like it was coming from the very bones of the earth. "What is that?" the woman with the large pearls shrieked, clutching her throat. "It's the building," Silas said, his eyes wide. "It's reacting to the locket, it's waking up." Julian Vane lunged at Elena, his hands outstretched like claws. "Give me that necklace. You're not destroying what I built." But Marcus Thorne was faster. He stepped between them, his fist connecting with Julian's jaw with a sickening crack. The chairman of the board collapsed onto the redwood table, scattering the shredded check like confetti. "Elena, listen to me," Marcus said, his voice urgent over the rising hum. "The building is entering a resonance loop. If you don't calibrate the locket to the main terminal, the vibrations will shatter every window in this spire. People will die." "Where's the terminal?" Elena yelled, the room starting to sway. "The basement," Silas said. "The foundation, the place where it all started, but you have to hurry. The security teams are already locking down the elevators. You'll have to go through the service shafts." Elena looked at the two brothers, the one who wanted to save the company and the one who wanted to save the truth. She looked at the locket, the silver feeling warm against her skin, almost as if it were beating. "Leo," she whispered. Her brother was just a few miles away. If this building came down, the entire block would go with it. "Go," Silas shouted. Elena didn't look back. She ran toward the emergency exit, her heels clicking rhythmically against the floor, matching the heartbeat of the building. She was no longer a waitress. She was no longer an heir. She was the only thing standing between the city and a nightmare made of glass and steel. As she plunged into the dark, echoing stairwell, she heard a voice over the building's intercom. It wasn't Arthur. It wasn't Marcus. It was a cold, synthesized voice that sounded like it came from the future. "Vance DNA detected. Protocol finality initiated." The descent into the heart of the machine, the shadows are growing longer, and the building itself is trying to stop her. Is Elena Vance the savior, or the one who will bring it all crashing down? The service stairwell was a world of gray concrete and flickering yellow light. As Elena descended, the hum she had felt in the boardroom transformed. It was no longer a sound, it was a physical force. It vibrated in her teeth, rattled her ribcage, and made the very air feel like it was made of static electricity. "Vance DNA verified. Sublevel 10 access granted." The mechanical voice followed her, echoing off the cold walls. Elena's lungs burned. Her thrift store blazer was soaked with sweat, and her breath came in ragged gasps. She reached the bottom floor, a place the elevators didn't go. The door was a massive slab of reinforced titanium with no handle and no keyhole. Elena stood before it, trembling. She looked at the silver locket. Following a primal instinct, she pressed the tarnished metal against the center of the door. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, a thin beam of blue light swept over her face, and the door groaned. It didn't slide. It retracted into the floor, revealing a chamber that looked like it belonged in a different century. It was the foundational vault. The room was vast and circular, dominated by a colossal pillar of black granite that stretched from the floor to the ceiling. This was the Vance stabilizer, the true heart of the spire. But it wasn't just steel and stone. It was covered in intricate, glowing copper etchings that pulsed with a rhythmic, golden light. It looked like a living nervous system made of metal. "You're late, Elena." Elena spun around. Standing in the shadows of the machinery was Marcus Thorne. He wasn't wearing his navy suit jacket anymore. His white shirt was rolled at the sleeves, and he was holding a handheld terminal plugged into the stabilizer's base. "Marcus," Elena gasped, clutching the locket. "What are you doing here? You said you were on my side." "I am on the side of the future," Marcus said, his voice strangely calm despite the roar of the machine. "Arthur is a dying man clinging to guilt. Julian is a greedy fool who wants to control people. But me, I understand what your grandfather really built." He stepped toward her, the golden light of the stabilizer reflecting in his eyes. "This isn't just a stabilizer, Elena. It's a power source, a way to tap into the kinetic energy of the Earth itself. It could provide free energy for every home in the city, but to activate it, the system needs a final calibration. It needs the Vance frequency." "Silas said it was a kill switch," Elena countered, taking a step back. "He said they wanted to use it to control people." "Silas is a dreamer who sees ghosts in every shadow," Marcus snapped. "He wants to destroy this building because he's afraid of power. But think of Leo, Elena. Think of the millions of people in the Bronx living in the dark, paying bills they can't afford. With your locket and my knowledge, we can turn this building into a beacon. We can change the world." The building shuddered violently. A crack appeared in the concrete floor, snaking toward the granite pillar. The golden light in the copper veins began to turn a violent, angry red. "Warning, resonance loop at 92%. Structural integrity failing." "The building is rejecting the override," Marcus yelled over the rising roar. "The kill switch is engaging automatically because it detects an unauthorized user. Give me the locket, Elena. If I don't sync it now, this spire will become a tuning fork that shatters every heart within 5 miles. Elena looked at the locket. She looked at Marcus. He sounded so convincing. He spoke of progress, of helping people like Leo. It was the same language Julian had used, just wrapped in a different lie. She looked at the copper etchings on the pillar. They weren't just designs. They were her father's handwriting, the same elegant, looping script she had seen on her birth certificate. And there, carved near the base in small, hidden letters, were 3 words. "Only for peace." "You're lying, Marcus," Elena said, her voice turning cold. "You don't want to give energy away. You want to be the one who owns the switch. You're just another vulture waiting for a man to die." Marcus's face transformed. The mask of the professional COO fell away, revealing a desperate, hungry ambition. "I've spent 15 years in Arthur's shadow. I've done the work while he sat in his office feeling sorry for himself. I won't let a waitress from the Bronx take this from me." He lunged at her. Elena dodged, her foot catching on a thick power cable. She fell hard, the locket skittering across the floor toward the glowing red pillar. Marcus scrambled for it, his fingers inches away from the silver. But the stabilizer let out a massive pulse of energy, a wave of pure sound that threw Marcus back against the wall like a rag doll. Elena crawled toward the pillar. The heat was immense. The air felt like it was boiling. She reached out and grabbed the locket. As her fingers closed around it, the vibration stopped being a noise and became a voice, her father's voice. "If you're reading this, Elena, it means the world wasn't ready. Close the loop. Set them free." There was a small, circular indentation at the very center of the granite pillar. It was the exact size of her locket. "Don't do it," Marcus screamed, struggling to stand. "You'll destroy the company. You'll be a nobody again. You'll go back to the grease and the dirt." Elena looked at him. She thought of the $28 in her pocket. She thought of the missed train. She thought of the man on the bench. "I'd rather be a nobody with a soul," she said, "than a queen in a cage." She pressed the locket into the pillar. The world turned white. There was no sound, only a blinding, pure light that seemed to wash away the gray concrete, the cold marble, and the lies of the 99th floor. The red veins of the machine turned a soft, calming blue. The roar faded into a gentle hum, a lullaby for a city that had been under tension for far too long. Then the floor beneath her gave way. The light fades, and the silence returns, but when Elena Vance opens her eyes, the world she knew is gone. Is it a tragedy, or is it a new beginning? The morning air was crisp, tasting of rain and new possibilities. Elena Vance stood on the steps of the Metropolitan General Hospital, watching the city wake up. For the first time in years, the knot of anxiety in her chest had unraveled. In her hand, she held a simple piece of paper, not a check, and not a legal waiver. It was a handwritten note from Arthur Sterling, delivered by a nurse just as the sun broke the horizon. "Elena, you didn't just save my heart. You saved my soul. The building is quiet now, but the world is finally listening." The fallout from the night had been swift. Julian Vane and the board members involved in the patent theft had been taken into custody for questioning. Marcus Thorne had disappeared into the shadows of the city, his ambition checked by a woman who chose mercy over power. But the real transformation wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the streets. 1 month later, the Sterling Dynamics building, the Vance Spire, stood as a testament to a new era. Elena didn't sell the company. She didn't tear it down. Instead, she did exactly what her father and grandfather had dreamed of. She opened the doors. The Kindness First initiative was her first executive order. It wasn't just a slogan, it was a revolution. Sterling Dynamics became the first corporation in the world to implement a life-first policy. No employee would ever be penalized for being late if they were helping a stranger. No one would be fired for choosing their humanity over a meeting. Elena sat in the office on the 99th floor, the same room where Julian had tried to buy her soul. But the redwood table was gone. In its place were comfortable chairs and low tables covered in blueprints for low-income housing and free energy grids. The door opened, and Leo walked in. He wasn't wearing his frayed hoodie anymore. He wore a crisp lab coat, his eyes bright with the excitement of a student who finally had the tools he needed. "The first batch of Vance generators is ready for the Bronx, L," he said, his voice thick with pride. "By winter, no one in our old neighborhood will have to choose between heat and food." Elena smiled, looking at the silver locket that now sat in a glass display case on her desk. It was no longer a secret weapon, it was a reminder. "He would have been proud, Leo," she whispered. "He is proud," Leo replied, squeezing her shoulder. As the sun set over the Hudson River, Elena walked down to the lobby. She saw a young woman, dressed in a thrift store blazer, rushing toward the exit. The woman stopped to help an intern who had dropped a stack of files. They laughed, shared a moment of connection, and then went on their way. Elena realized then that Arthur was right. Kindness isn't just a gesture, it's contagious. It's a ripple in a pond that eventually becomes a wave that changes the world. She walked out of the revolving doors and toward the subway station. A limousine was waiting for her, but she waved it off. She wanted to feel the pavement under her feet. She wanted to hear the pulse of the city she had saved. As she reached the platform of the downtown express, she saw a man sitting on the same bench where she had found Arthur. He looked tired, his head in his hands. Elena didn't keep walking. She didn't check her watch. She sat down beside him. "Rough day?" she asked, offering him a bottle of water from her bag. The man looked up, surprised that someone in a city of millions had seen him. Yeah, he whispered. The roughest. It gets better, Elena said, her voice a warm anchor in the chaos of the station. Sometimes, the train you miss is the one that leads you exactly where you're meant to be. Because in a world that tells you to move faster, to climb higher, and to look out only for yourself, Elena Vance proved that the greatest power isn't found in a bank account or a skyscraper. It's found in the 30 seconds you take to hold a stranger's hand. Elena Vance changed her life and her city with a single choice. But this story isn't just about her, it's about you. Every day you pass a train you're afraid to miss. Every day you see a stranger who needs a hand. What if your next act of kindness is the key to your own kingdom? Have you ever helped a stranger when it cost you something? Share your story in the comments below. Let's start a ripple that turns into a wave. If this story reminded you that there is still good in this world, hit that like button and subscribe. Join us as we tell the stories of the warriors of the heart. Because sometimes the person you help might just be the one who saves you.